All right, guys. So real quick, we're going to go through the fourth part of chapter 7, which is control conditions and manipulation checks. This corresponds to learning objectives number 8 and 9, which talks about the types of control conditions and what they are. Two of the primary ones, placebo and non-treatment or no treatment conditions, and then also the manipulation checks, when to use them, what they are, how you recognize them, things like that. So there are, in some experiments, if you don't want to compare two basically experimental conditions, if you don't want to compare two, treatments or two of something, if you're just wanting to look at whether one thing has one level or one thing has an effect, then you may use a lot of times this is for treatment purposes, right? Or a training program or things like that. Does it improve scores or does it improve depression symptoms or things like that? You want to compare no treatment to the treatment, and those are the two groups that you want. So you want to see how people react when they don't have the training or the treatment or whatever it is, and then how they react when they do. And so those two conditions would be the experimental condition that actually receives the treatment or the training or whatever it is, and then the control would be the non-treatment or no treatment condition. Now, not all experiments obviously have these distinctions. Some will not have a control condition. It just depends on what it is that you're studying. But we do want to talk about it because there are a lot of research studies out there, and may be something that you're interested in doing that will require a control condition. So what are the control conditions? So the two primary kinds are the no treatment control condition and a placebo control condition. The no treatment is when you are not the participants, not you, I'm sorry, the participants are not receiving the treatment at all, right? That's kind of what we were just talking about. So you can look at it as, when we were talking about other studies, we talked about how you could do like a high, medium, and low group on some variable, on your independent variable. This would just be like if there'd be like a level 0, right? So the no treatment condition would be the 0 condition, and then the treatment condition would be the 100% condition, right? They have the full training. There could be variations of that as well. You could have a level 0, a no treatment condition, and then you could have a low treatment condition where they only receive part of the treatment, and then you could have a high treatment condition where they receive all of the treatment or more of the treatment. So obviously there's different ways that you can conduct it depending on what it is that you're trying to find. Now the placebo control condition is a little bit different. A lot of you know what placebos are. It's just an ineffective treatment. It has no effect. The placebo term is a medical term originally, and so it comes from no medicinal effect is what it says. But a placebo has grown to refer to anything that the participant thinks is going to have an effect, but it does not. And so um, the there the problem with doing a placebo sometimes is something you have to be aware of is the placebo effect. So if an individual thinks that the treatment is going to be effective, it may in fact look like it is effective because they are reacting as if they really did receive some sort of treatment, just because the mind is a powerful thing and they think it's going to have an effect, and so it ends up looking like it had an effect. Whether or not it really did, it may have just been because they thought it was going to. This can also apply to therapy when it is used in elements of therapy, like a therapeutic approach or a type of therapy. If you're trying to see if that is effective, a placebo there is usually referred to as non-specific. It is not usually, the placebo term is not usually used when it comes to therapy. So if you see that term non-specific, it's basically talking about a placebo in terms of therapy. So some examples your book gives is, inactive drugs. So they may give a participant a pill that they think is going to be psychotropic in some way, or some kind of, it's going to affect them physically or mentally in some way, but it is not. It doesn't have any medicine in it, right? Um, Another example is when participants are given a beverage, they think there's alcohol in it, but it's actually non-alcoholic, but then they end up exhibiting signs as if they were giving an alcoholic beverage. And then another example it gives is, again, those non-specific psychotherapies. So they think the therapy is going to have an effect, and so they seem to react as if they were actually undergoing therapy, even though they didn't actually receive the type of therapy they thought they were receiving. Um, so the importance of the placebo effect is going to depend again on your design, on what kind of research you're doing. Outcome research investigates the effectiveness of a treatment. So the goal here is really just to determine whether the treatment is helping or not, right? And so even if a placebo effect is part of that, even if part of it is there that the people think it's going to work, so it works, that's fine as long as it works, right? And so outcome research isn't necessarily concerned with whether the placebo is affecting it or not, or whether the placebo effect is occurring. But process research, they actually want to know what components of the therapy or the treatment is working, or the training. And so that you have to remove the placebo effect so that you can see whether it's actually the training or what parts of the training or treatment is working and what part was just the placebo effect. And so you would use a placebo control group condition in order to remove that placebo effect. And what that means is that you would have a no treatment condition, possibly, but you would have a placebo condition, and then you would have a true treatment condition, and you would compare the placebo control condition and the treatment condition to see if there's a difference between the two. If there's not, then, or I mean, if there is a difference there, then your treatment was effective, and so you don't have to worry about looking at that placebo. Now, I want to remind you guys here that the controlling of extraneous variables is different. This kind of control we're talking about here is an actual control group or condition. Controlling for extraneous variables that we talked about in the last video is essential for assignments to keep them internally and externally valid. Control groups or conditions like this are only needed if the type of research you're doing requires it, or it's beneficial. So that's an optional thing. Wanted to clarify that. Manipulation checks are where it's an additional check or a measure to make sure that the intended effect that you wanted the independent variable to have on your dependent variable actually occurred. So the participants may either suspect something about the manipulation, or maybe they weren't manipulated in the way you wanted them to be manipulated. And so an example here is, if we're talking about ways to check it, one of the ways is to just explicitly measure the independent variable. So normally we don't measure the independent variable, right? We're measuring the dependent variable. But for the independent variable, like let's say you were trying to manipulate mood. So you put them in a depressed mood or a happy mood or whatever. How do you know for sure they were really in a happy mood or a depressed mood? Because if you were measuring their performance on a test, that was your dependent variable, you don't actually know for sure that the mood was manipulated. And if you don't know for sure, then how do you know if that's affected their performance on a test? And so you could actually give them questions, ask them questions about mood, or have them fill out a mood inventory or whatever to check and make sure that their mood was actually manipulated the way that you wanted it to be, that the people that were in the depressed mood group actually felt sad, and the people that were in the happy mood group actually were manipulated to feel happy. Now, another way is that you can ask specific questions in an exit questionnaire or survey after the experiment is over. You can say, questions like, did you enjoy the experiment? How long did it take you to do it? Did you get bored? What do you think the purpose was? Did you suspect anything about, being deceived or any kind of manipulation. Or you can specifically ask them about the elements of the manipulation from the study. You can say, did you notice that we dimmed the lights 15 minutes in? Or did you notice that the researchers' responses were harsh or critical or encouraging, or whatever your manipulation was? You can just directly ask them, and that's another way to check the manipulation. Now, there's 4 situations where you need to make sure that you're doing a manipulation check. And one of those is when you're manipulating the participants, kind of like what we already talked about. The example they give is frustration. Again, if you were trying to put them in a frustrated state in one group and not in the other, you want to make sure that the frustrated group really was frustrated and that the not frustrated group really wasn't frustrated, in order to know for sure that you can even compare the 2 groups, right? You have to make sure that your independent variable was doing what you wanted it to do before you can even worry about the dependent variable. Subtle manipulations. So if it's things that are not really blatantly manipulative, like subtle facial expression changes, like smiling versus not smiling, or raising eyebrows or things like that, or subtle word changes in the instructions or in something they read. If it's not, you have to make sure that they actually picked up on those things. If those were your changes between the 2 groups, you want to make sure that they really were different. And then placebo controls and simulations, both of those things, it's essential that the participants think that they're real, that those are real situations, or a real treatment. They don't know that it's a placebo, right? Otherwise, it defeats the purpose. So in psychotherapy, what term is used in place of placebo? Again, we talked about that. That is that non-specific term. And so then our learning check real quick. What is the purpose for using a control condition in an experiment? Hopefully you have realized that they're trying to trick you here. These bottom 3 are talking about those controls for extraneous variables that we talked about in the last video. And as I said, that's very different. A control condition in an experiment, a control group, is providing that baseline to evaluate the size of a treatment effect. Then an experiment includes a treatment, a no treatment, and a placebo. Which 2 conditions could be compared to determine the size of the effect that is actually caused by the treatment? And so if we scroll up, you'll see that it's placebo versus treatment. So again, if you compare the placebo to the treatment condition, it's going to tell you the actual effect of the treatment, right? If you compare the placebo to the no treatment condition, you could see if there was a placebo effect, right? Because if the placebo group is higher or changes from the no treatment group, then there wasn't a placebo effect, right? Because the placebo group should, in theory, be the same as the no treatment group. And then a researcher exposes people to a stressful situation, such as public speaking, to examine the effect of stress on depressed mood. So why would they want to measure stress? Well, again, like we just talked about, you're putting them in a stressful situation. But what if public speaking isn't a stressful situation for them? You're not going to be able to see if their stress affects their mood if they aren't stressed. So it is a manipulation check to make sure that your intended manipulation of stress actually works, so that you can then assess if stress affects mood. Okay, so that's it.